The number 13 seems to be very prolific among many different people. We have 13 stories today, and every single one of them are truly interesting, creepy, and sometimes even downright unexplainable. Over the past couple of weeks, I have been polling on Twitter and on YouTube, asking you guys what stories you would like to hear compiled into an extra long video. A lot of you guys made your voices very, very clear, and I took those stories you guys sent in and made them into this video. So yes, you may have heard some of these in the past, and you may not have heard any of these ever before, but I hope you guys enjoy them as much as I enjoyed reading them. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this channel going. This happened when I was in college, 4 years ago. I went to a university that was very close to an ocean on the East Coast. I made friends with some people on the weekend, and one guy in the group of people I met invited us to go out on his boat with him. He described his boat to a bunch of people, and was very proud to have it. It sounded like an expensive sailboat by the way he described it. Not really familiar with boats, and hadn't ever really been on one other than a cruise ship when I was like 11. This guy said his parents bought one for him, and that made sense because he was known to be a spoiled kid. He was nice enough though, and the idea of cruising around some Saturday afternoon and drinking some beers sounded appealing. After that conversation, I saw him around in school, but didn't really talk to him much, until one day he approached me in the library and asked if I still wanted to go sailing. I said sure, that sounded awesome, and he told me the following day he was going out on the water, and it would be a perfect opportunity for me to join him. After a lengthy conversation about how sailing works, and him assuring me it was safe and he had all the proper training, I told him I'd meet him at the docks the next morning. That night, my roommate asked me what I was doing for the weekend, and I told him that I made plans to go out sailing. He freaked out on me and told me he really wished he could go, and that I was sure that the other guy would be cool with it. The next morning, my roommate and I grabbed some coffee and grabbed some beer to bring along with us on our voyage. We ate some breakfast, and then we headed over to the docks to meet the guy. We were pretty excited, and when we got there, we followed the direction he gave me and found his boat. It was a huge orange and white sailboat. We stood on the dock next to the boat looking at it, when the guy popped his head up from somewhere and immediately showed a look of concern on his face. He jumped off the side of the boat onto the dock next to us. He looked at my roommate and then myself and asked, "Who is this?" I told him he was my roommate, he was cool, and that he had asked if he could come along. I told him I didn't think he would mind. The guy looked very annoyed, and it was awkward as hell for a few moments. The guy kept looking back and forth at the boat and then us. He took his hat off and rubbed his head like he was really stressed out. Eventually he sighed and said it was fine. I'll fast forward now to the part of the story that was scary as hell. A few hours later, we were on the boat, drinking and having fun. The water was pretty smooth sailing, and the sun was shining bright on us. The guy acted a bit off the whole time, and I figured it was because I brought my roommate. After drinking 3 or 4 beers, I felt the courage to ask the guy what was wrong, and if he was still pissed I brought my roommate. He responded with something along the lines of, "It just kind of ruined my plans." My roommate chimed in, with a smile on his face, and asked the guy, "What plans?" I could tell my roommate thought it was funny because it sounded like the guy wanted to be alone with me. The guy looked at him and said, "Well, because you're here, I can't kill him." This took me off guard completely, and I felt fear and unbelievable relief hit me at the same time. My roommate and this guy started cracking up, and my roommate brushed it off as a joke. I honestly didn't know what to think. Was this guy serious? Did I avoid being killed by this asshole? Is his sense of humor just that weird? I believe I got my answer when I went below the deck an hour later to grab another beer from the fridge. Next to his fridge was a brown swinging door that led to a small private bedroom quarters. I was feeling the beer pretty good by this point, and without thinking, pushed the door open. Laying on the foot of the bed was a big-ass cinder block, some yellow rope, tape, and what looked like a recorder of some sort. After seeing that, I felt sick to my stomach and wanted off that boat as soon as possible. I wanted to go back up and confront the guy, but decided against it because of what he might have been on, who knows what he was capable of. Could be on some serious drugs or even worse. What seemed like hours and hours more of being with this guy, we finally made it back to the dock. We said our goodbyes, and on the way back to my room, I told my roommate about what I had seen. He couldn't believe it. I'm pretty damn sure that my roommate saved my life that day by wanting to go with me. And I kid you not, I never saw that guy again on campus. What he had planned, I don't know, and I really don't want to think about it. My brother is a mortician at a facility in New York, and one night when I was visiting, he asked if I wanted to go to work with him so I wouldn't be alone in his house. I reluctantly said yes. What's the worst that can happen, right? Boy, was I wrong. To start off with, this place was creepy as hell, dark and smelled funny. He said it was normal, and it was probably the smell of the formaldehyde, so I just ignored it. After a little time of chit-chatting and catching up, he told me that he needed to get to work, but that I could stay in the little adjoined office and watch some TV, and so that's exactly what I did for a little bit. The entrance to the morgue had swinging doors, and you could hear when someone was coming in or out of them. He came to check on me a few times, so I heard them. After a few hours of being by myself, I started to doze off, when the sudden sound of the doors woke me up. Expecting for my brother to walk in and greet me, there was nothing. Again, I started to fall asleep, and yet again, the loud doors went off. You couldn't tell if someone was coming in or out, but they kept on swinging and didn't stop. Thinking my brother was playing a joke on me, I got up and went to tell him to stop, but to my surprise, there was only a little girl standing there, playing by the doors, pushing them. "Hi," I told her. She looked at me and didn't say a word. One of the things that caught my eye was a pretty blue dress with a pink ribbon that she was wearing. "Your dress is pretty, and the bow makes it stand out." Again, no reply. She looked down and started to run the opposite way, towards a lonesome hall. I thought the kid belonged to another employee, so I went back to my chair and sat down. A couple of hours later, when my brother's shift was over, he finally woke me up to go back to his place. As we were driving, I started to tell him about the doors and the little girl with the cute blue dress and big pink ribbon. He slammed the brakes. "What the hell? Why did you brake?" "Tessa," he told me with a chilling look on his face. "Last night I did an autopsy on a little girl that drowned. She was wearing a blue dress with a big pink ribbon." My blood ran cold, and I've never been to work with my brother ever again.
I've been listening for a couple of months. I've essentially heard every piece of content you have to offer at this point. Many of the stories made me ponder on my past. I grew up in a very rural area. Without saying it, I live in the middle of the United States. I have lived quite a few places, and at this specific piece of property, I had run-ins with crazy humans, odd sleep paralysis, and lucid dreams, even potential extraterrestrial happenings. Depending on how this goes over, I'll tell more, but here it goes. One cold winter morning, I woke up ready to go explore our acreage. My folks were out of the state, showing livestock, so it was me and my younger brother. Our nearest living neighbor was about 15 miles away. Adjacent to our property ran a fence for miles that enclosed these behemoths. At the front of the neighboring property, there was a large red barn and a 10-plus foot tall gate, locked with large chains and a padlock. My younger brother, who we'll call Sam, and I went to patrol the fence and make sure everything was okay, as we did every day. As soon as I opened the garage door, trusty little 22 on my shoulder, ready to go, I froze in fear, staring down a longhorn calf. Now, when I say calf, I mean this thing was eye level with me, being a 6'3" tall, gangly teenager. I call it a calf because it didn't have the enormous horns. I immediately pushed Sam behind me and slowly walked back until I could close the garage. I called my dad and the farmer, who called the police. My dad told me to leave Sam inside and check the front gate. I hopped on my rickety three-wheeler and rode about a half-mile to the front gate. Lying right in front was a fully grown longhorn steer on its side, deceased, with its stomach cut open from throat to back. It looked like it had been dropped, its left horn embedded in the soil, as if it had slowly been set down. Now we had our fair share of poachers out there. I'd been chased by one, a story for another time. The oddest part was the fence was completely closed and chained, as it was the day before when I had checked. There was no meat taken, nor any blood on the ground. The rancher and police showed up shortly after and deemed it likely poaching. Later that day, once everything settled down, I snuck through the electric fence into the area the longhorns had been grazing when I went to bed the previous night. The tall reed-like grass was pushed down in opposite directions, not in any specific pattern, but I remember recalling it odd. I began to exit the farmer's land through a small stream I liked to hunt and found a coyote dead and dissected in the same way. There was no blood and no sign of animals eating on it. Let me know what you guys think it was. I'm not sold on aliens, but I'm open to ideas.
I spent the night at my girlfriend's house one night and had to leave really early in the morning to go to work. So early, it was still dark outside when I left, and would be for a few more hours. She lived in a rural town about 60 miles from my house and work, and when I got in my car and started driving, there weren't the usual street lights lining the roads to guide me. The only light that came was from my headlights. About 10 miles into my drive, my car started to slow down and eventually came to a stop. I first checked my gas and it was almost full. I'm not a very car trouble savvy guy, so I dug my phone out of my pocket and swiped the screen open, and nothing happened. I realized that my phone was dead. Just my luck. And immediately after that, I came to the realization that I had forgotten to plug it in last night before we went to sleep. So here I was, stuck in my car on the side of a rural street, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. I started to think of things to do. I could start walking. No, that's a horrible idea. It was dark as hell out there, and I wouldn't be able to see anything while walking. And on top of that, somebody could hit me. I concluded that the only thing I could do was sit in my car and wait for daylight, which is a very stressful and scary thing to have to come to terms with. It was winter, and I started getting cold. I tried starting my car over and over to no avail. I gave up and crossed my arms. I sat in the dark car on the dark street for about 10 minutes just looking into the darkness in front of me, before I squinted my eyes and noticed somebody walking towards my car, directly in front of me. They were about 30 yards away. The only thing I could see was the outline of their body. They stopped right after I noticed them. I got really scared and just gazed at his outline for the longest time. In a sudden movement, they started walking again, but fast. In a few seconds they reached my driver's side door and tried to open it. Did they think the car was empty? Holy hell, did they see me in here? I leaned away from the car door and window and onto the center console. After failing to open my locked door, they stood there for a moment, and then very suddenly turned and walked away in the direction they came from. I was so confused and creeped out by this. Why would they walk back the way they came? I don't get it. I sat there in the dark wondering what was happening, when all of a sudden I saw 2 headlights come out in front of me. The car was parked on the same side of the road as mine, but facing me. Had the person stopped when they saw my car? What would they do next? How did I not see them stop there? After a few moments, they started their engine and turned their car around, driving off down the road. A few hours later, the sun was rising and a truck stopped next to me to ask if I was having trouble. I asked to use their cell phone, and with it I called my girlfriend, who picked me up soon after.
This story is about my brother Alec. The story begins in Ohio with Alec, who is 3, and Abigail, who is 6. They were there with my mother, Olivia. They were visiting Olivia's brother, Elliot, in a small town in Ohio. We went to church with Elliot and some family members. As we were coming home from church, Elliot saw something in the sky. The 3 of us were in the back seat playing and talking to each other. As we were going down this country road, Elliot saw there was no one following him, so he decided to stop and get out of the car for a closer look at the object in the sky. The 3 of us stopped playing and were now watching what the adults were doing. Elliot pulled over and got out. Then Olivia, who was sitting at the other door, got out. Then suddenly Elliot hollered at Olivia, telling her to get back in the car because he was going to get home as fast as possible to call the police. She quickly listened and said, "Elliot, what are the police going to do?" He replied, "I don't know, call the military? It looks like we're under attack." Elliot's wife, Isabel, said, "They don't seem hostile." The 3 of us were looking out the window and all we could see were stars. We arrived home and Elliot went to the phone. The object was over the house. Elliot told Isabel to hide us kids, to which she replied, "But where?" "In the closets," Elliot said. Elliot got on the phone with the operator. They quickly answered and said, "Operator 9, how can I help you?" Elliot replied, "I need the police." He was put on hold for a moment. Still on the line, he went over to the window and looked outside. Soon the operator came back and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but the police line is busy. Would you like to hold?" Elliot quickly said, "Yes, please." About 10 minutes went by, and finally the police were on the line. "Police, what's your emergency?" Elliot said, "Thank God. There's this huge aircraft above the house. It's a triangle shape, and there's lights all underneath it." But oddly, what the police said back was, "If it's above your house, sir, there's nothing we can do. We can get someone to eventually come out from the military to make a report." When Elliot pressed the police officer on the other end, the police explained, "Sir, you're the 5th caller about this. I'm sorry, I have to hang up now." He quickly looked back up at Isabel and asked if the kids were in the closets now. She said yes, but said that she believes if that thing lands, then we're all going to perish. Olivia agreed. Elliot went outside and the 2 women followed. Apparently, despite the size of the aircraft and its close proximity, it was completely silent, just sitting in the sky, as if it wasn't there at all. Eventually, a police officer actually did show up, which was unexpected. Elliot quickly met him and asked what he thought that thing was, to which the policeman replied he didn't know, that he'd never seen anything like it. After a lot of time had passed, the kids were able to come outside and begin to play. Soon we stopped and watched the policeman and Elliot talk. Then, without any warning, the craft above us suddenly took off. The speed at which it moved was impossible, and it left no trace in the sky or below. "Did you see that?" Elliot said to the policeman. "What in the world?" the policeman muttered. "What do you have to say about that?" Elliot asked. I don't know. I don't know how to report this," the policeman responded. Then he left. Elliot shooed the kids inside and had them ready for bed, while Isabel and Olivia were dumbfounded. That's it?" Isabel wondered. After the kids were in bed, they turned on the TV to see if anything would be shown. The news did report this, talking about a strange object that had been seen in the sky. Over 1,000 people ended up reporting it. The Air Force had been called, but they hadn't responded at that time. Soon they all went to bed, confused and hoping the thing wouldn't come back. We assumed that that was the end of it, though. One bizarre, unexplainable sighting for a lifetime. But something happened in 1979, particularly to me. I was lying in my bed. I was having trouble sleeping, tossing and turning. At one point, I turned over on my back and opened my eyes, and there I saw at the foot of my bed a creature that you would now call a gray. It didn't have a mouth, but I heard it somehow speaking to me, and I remember word for word what I heard it saying. "Tonight, you perish, and you go to hell." I screamed for Albert, my sister's father-in-law, to bring something to protect me from the man in my bedroom. I ran to the front door trying to get away from the monster. When I turned back toward my bed, ready for the worst to happen, ready for it to pounce on me or something, I saw that I was alone in my room. 8 years after my incident, my brother Alec had his encounter. He was 23 at the time, and he was living in a cabin in the hills of West Virginia. One night he was getting ready to smoke. The night was the same as any other. The crickets were chirping peacefully, and he had a coal fire going in the cabin. It was a pretty cold night after all. Then suddenly, all the noises went silent. Alex said he had been so involved with what he was doing that he didn't pay attention. Then out of nowhere, the cabin lit up. The light showed every crack in the walls that were open. Alex thought it was the police. He took his stash and pried up a board on the floor of the cabin. He put all his stuff there and closed the board again. Then he walked to the door and kept waiting for the police to knock. But Alec never heard it. As he was opening the door, the light was so bright outside, it hurt his eyes. He shouted, "Who's there?" But no answer came. Alec closed the door and hid under his bed. The next thing he knew, he was awake in bed, and he didn't know how he got there. The coal fire was out too, even though he said he had enough coal in there to last for 2 days. But the fire was out, and the coal had all burned up, and his memory was blank. Alec moved out of the cabin and never went back. About 15 years later, I was in the Bahamas with my daughter and her friends. One night, my boyfriend and I went out to dinner, and the 4 young adults stayed in the boat. When we came back to the boat, my daughter told me that the 4 of them were sitting on the front of it when some sort of object came over the boat and hovered there. She said the last thing she remembered before blacking out was looking up at it. The next thing they knew, they woke up in the cabin. No idea how they got there. I'm beginning to believe that aliens work with families that they have encountered. They stick with generations of families, haunting them, following them, and probably even abducting them. A few of us in the family believe that, but we keep it to ourselves, as we don't want people thinking we're crazy.
My name is Tyler, and I wanted to share my haunting experience with you. I've had many different paranormal events happen to me, but this one definitely stands out among them. I've always had a sort of hyper-awareness of other worlds being layered with our own, for lack of a better term. Because of this sight, as I call it, I've been in trouble with insomnia most of my life. This happened back when I was about 17. My girlfriend and I had just moved into a small house together. We were in bed one night, and I let my mental guard down as I was finally beginning to drift off to sleep. I was in that moment where you're somehow both asleep and awake at once. Those who have experience with sleep paralysis know this feeling very well. I was just about to close my eyes when I felt something step into the doorway of the bedroom. I was too far gone to be able to look up and see what it was, but I could sense it vividly. It was a male, or masculine being. Its essence was full of intensity and pure malice. It struck me with a deep, primal fear as I realized what was happening. I knew that this entity meant me harm, that it was not human. I also knew it wasn't a dream. This was real. I felt the negative energy radiating from it as it seemed to float across my room, stopping near the foot of my bed. Still unable to move, questions raced through my mind. Who are you? What do you want with me? It stood there, suspended in time and space, staring at me in absolute silence. On my tongue and in my nostrils, I could taste the evil and smell the hatred coming from this being. I don't know how else to explain this experience. It slowly moved in my field of vision, but I could still barely make out a single feature of its form. As if it was enveloped in darkness, it simply peered over me with violent intent. Everything about the situation screamed, "This thing wants to kill me," but I somehow knew it could not. It was really just there to make me feel this unbelievable level of fear. It raised a part of itself which looked like an arm, before slamming it down into my gut, striking so hard it took the wind out of my lungs. The pain and shock of the attack snapped me out of my paralysis, and I jumped up as quickly as I could. I was out of my mind with terror and reached out to my girlfriend to wake her. I yelled her name and even shook her, but she just wouldn't wake up. I felt like I was somehow out of a phase with her reality and she couldn't hear me. I struggled to wake her for what seemed like forever. I eventually collapsed in exhaustion and fell asleep. When I awoke in the morning, I had bruises on my stomach and face, and my girlfriend wouldn't believe a word I said. That's where my story ends. Just one of my many experiences with things I struggle to reconcile with reality as I know it. Please let me know what you think about this.
Hello, you can call me E. I've worked with the park rangers for about 10 years before moving out of state and into a different profession. I don't know that my story is necessarily scary, but it is strange. I won't specify where I was working at the time, other than to say that I worked in the Midwest when this all happened. I will say I really enjoyed my years as a park ranger. They were wonderful, and in this case, a bit strange. The oddity began when I was doing my morning patrol and found what looked to be a painted angel on a tree. Now, it was oddly well detailed. If this had been painted on a canvas, not on one of our beautiful trees, I wouldn't have minded. But because it was one of our trees, though, I had to take some photos and write up a report to give to my supervisor. I scoured the area and found no sign of paint or anything. Figuring it was either an artist or some sort of vandalism, I filed my report and went about my day. 5 hours go by when we're approached at the station by someone freaking out. They explained that they found a jogger lying dead next to a tree with an angel. I wasn't freaked out by this, but I did find it strange. I followed the woman to find it was the very same tree. We had the paramedics arrive soon after, and it was later on that I discovered the elderly man had died of a heart attack. Alright, that's weird, but I believe in coincidence, and so I just figured it was one of those odd but unfortunate things that sometimes happens in life. A couple of months go by, and I've forgotten all about the older man and the painted angel. Once again, while wandering our parks, I noticed yet another painted angel. This one was not on a tree, though. It was on a bench. It wasn't large or anything, unlike the first one. This was a smaller angel. I was a little thrown, but my mind being the way it is, decided it was probably some person who was inspired in some weird way by the art and saw the story in the paper. The next day, a young woman was found lying at the bench. We thought she might have been sleeping, but upon attempting to wake her up, she was found to be dead. The reason for this was quite explainable, though. She was shooting up heroin and had come here overnight to do so. The final cause of this woman's passing was an overdose, but they didn't think it was a suicide. I mention this because she was sitting on the angel painted on the bench at the time of her death. The thought was initially the woman painted it, then committed some weird ritualistic suicide of some kind. This was ruled out when the cause of death was reported later on. Police and, well, to be honest, we rangers were completely perplexed as to how this was happening, or why. Who was painting these angels? And why at every place one was painted, would someone die? It created a bit of conversation, but as a year passed without any other deaths or incidents, people kind of just let it go, myself included. It was around Christmas of the following year that the strangest one happened. This one didn't actually happen in the park I worked at the time, but at a church in the town that I worked in. Another angel had appeared. It was painted in red as always on the back of the church itself. Knowing how the previous incidents occurred, people grew naturally curious. The angel that was painted was much larger than the others, and above the head and wings were the words, "May they know peace." This was the first time a message had appeared with an angel, and every attempt to remove the angel was futile. No matter what was used, it remained there. Having given up, with nothing happening over a couple of weeks, people pretty much thought this one was a prank, and the others were a coincidence. That was until one Sunday, when the church was having a service and a big lunch that afternoon. During the prayer and worship service, some of the members were prepping the food and the stoves. The stoves were gas, and upon ignition, a leak would cause an explosion that killed everyone inside instantly and burned the church to the ground. After this, we never saw another painted angel, or any other kind of strange symbols around town. This was the final one, and all three had predicted death or deaths of some kind. I'm not sure how to explain that rationally, but it was such a strange sequence of events that I felt the need to share it. Who was painting the angels? Did they know these souls would die? Was it a warning? Or was it simply a strange pre-memorial? Well, I'm sure we'll never know.
In July of 2018, my family and I went to my aunt and uncle's house in Maryland. They go on vacation for a weekend, and they let us stay at their house. They live like 10 minutes away from Baltimore, so we usually go there for a day and go back to the house later. Everything was fine until the third night. When we got back to the house, my dad and brother went upstairs because they were tired. My mom and I went into my uncle's office to go on his computer to see what we could do the next day. We heard some strange noises. My mom just assumed they were house noises, but the noises seemed a bit heavy to be house noises. My mom went to the bathroom and I sat at the computer looking at attractions when I heard my uncle's dog growling from the living room. She only growls or barks when she sees someone she doesn't recognize, so I got a little scared. My mom came out of the bathroom, and I told her the dog is growling at something. She went to the living room to check on the dog, and everything seemed normal except for one thing. The lamp was on, but the thing about that is I remember seeing it unplugged entirely. The lamp is also in the corner behind the giant couch, and the cord has a switch on it to turn it on or off, but the switch was closer to the floor. It would take a lot of effort to plug it in and turn it on. She assumed it was me and turned it off, but I kept telling her I didn't turn it on at all. I decided to go to bed, which I kind of regret doing.
I fell asleep pretty fast, but I woke up at 3 in the morning to a strange sound. I just kept hearing a squeaky mattress noise over and over again. I knew it wasn't my parents because I heard my dad snoring, and I knew my brother wasn't making that noise because I heard him snoring as well. All of our bedroom doors were open, so it was pretty easy to hear, but I was the only one hearing it. I started hearing the dog growling viciously from the living room. I was covered in my sweat, and my fear was rising. I then heard footsteps coming from the attic right above my room. I was wide awake at that point, and was gonna wake up my parents, but since I was so scared, I didn't want to move. Eventually, all the noises stopped, but the dog was still viciously growling at something or even someone. She stopped growling after about 5 minutes. Everything was seemingly fine after that, but I had no interest in falling back asleep, and didn't get out of bed until I saw my brother get out of bed at sunrise. I asked him if he heard anything at all at 3 in the morning, but he said no. I also asked my parents if they heard anything, and they also said no. My mind was blown, and I thought I was going crazy. For the rest of the week, everything was fine, and that dog kept growling at something every once in a while. I kind of wish I got up out of bed to see what was squeaking, but I was also way too scared. I also wish I got up to see what the dog was growling at, but no way in hell was I going to go up into that attic. I don't know if I was just hallucinating, witnessing paranormal activity, or what, but I definitely don't know, and it definitely was not a dream.
This happened when I was 17 years old. I am now 30, and it's the first time I've talked about this in 10 years. After listening to some experiences on this channel, I've decided to share mine. I'll start off with some background information. I've always loved the outdoors and grew up always playing outside and exploring up in the mountains for fossils, wildflowers, or anything I could find that interested me. My mom loved flowers and gardening, so sometimes I would go just to find her as many wildflowers as I could to bring back to her. I won't give my exact location away for privacy reasons, of course, but we lived in a very rural community, away from town in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. When I say away from the town, I mean everyone who lives here is about a 20-minute drive from even the nearest gas station or grocery store. As if that isn't far enough, we lived away from our neighbors, taking a gravel road off the main road up into the narrow valley in between two mountains. The school bus only ran on the main road, so I had to walk this gravel road early in the morning to the main road to catch the bus. It was pretty far away from the school, so I had to catch the bus really early. In fall and spring, it was always still dark when I got to the bus. Anytime I went up into the mountains or walked down my road to the bus in the dark, or any time when it was dark for that matter, I'd always take my dog with me. He was a beagle mix and was very intelligent. He would walk right by my side or a little in front of me. If he got too far ahead of me for my comfort, I would yell at him to wait and he would stop and look back at me until I caught up with him. He would also sit beside me till I got on my bus, and then I would watch him through the windows, walking back up to my road. He was my dad's hunting dog and my guardian. Although being a pretty small dog, he didn't scare easily. I've seen him chase coyotes out of our yard and wrestle raccoons bigger than him, and bark and snap and bounce around at a bear that used to come around sometimes. All that being said, I'll get into my encounters. The first time wasn't really an actual encounter, but more of something that was very strange and left me rather uneasy. My dog and I, whose name is Fred, were walking down my gravel road to the main road to catch the school bus. We made it to the main road and I was waiting for the bus when Fred and I heard some type of weird shrill scream come up from the way in the mountain on the other side of the main road. It was very loud, but still sounded too far away for me to really freak out.
I just looked down at my watch and looked at Fred, who was now standing up, looking in the direction of the scream, with his ears pinned back. So he had heard it too. Luckily, just a minute or two later, the bus came and I got on and sat down and watched my dog start back up our road. It was a pretty long drive to school, so I sat and thought about what I had heard. Now, I've lived in the middle of nowhere my entire life and have seen and heard many different animals, and it didn't sound like anything I have ever heard before, which made me a little unsettled. After getting to school and being around my friends and doing my work, the thought of it left my mind. That was until the next morning. I was waiting on the bus again, Fred by my side when we heard it again. Except this time it sounded closer than the morning before, which freaked me out a little more. I looked at Fred again, standing up, staring towards the noise with his ears pinned back again. But this time he got up and sat in front of me rather than beside me. Thankfully, the bus came and I hurried on and sat down, looked out the window to see Fred still sitting there staring up in the mountains instead of walking back home. So later that evening, when I got home from school, I was relieved to see that he went home after I had gotten on the bus. This went on every morning that week, and each time it sounded like it was a little closer than before. Then, after like 4 days, it just suddenly stopped. A couple of months went by without hearing anything, so it left my mind and I didn't give it another thought. By now it was summer and I usually walked up in the mountains in front of my house about once a week when it was warm. It was going to be a really nice day out the next day, so I planned the night before to go to the mountains and make an all-day thing out of it rather than just a few hours. So I got up and the next morning at about daybreak and proceeded to pack my backpack with some sandwiches and drinks, my pocket knife, which I always took with me, and I wasn't allowed to mess with my dad's guns, so I just took his hunting knife and a makeshift spear I had made, which just was a thick, sturdy stick I used for walking with a tip sharpened down to a very narrow point. I woke my mom up before I left and told her I was leaving, and the area around where I was going, and that I would be gone all day and not to worry if I wasn't back in my normal 2 to 3 hours. This was in 2006 and I didn't have a cell phone because they didn't work in my area anyway, because of the mountains, so she just told me not to, get in any trouble. And to obviously not forget to whistle if I needed help. Which, as far as I intended on going this day, probably would have done not much of any good anyway. But I took it so she wouldn't worry as much. So Fred and I set off up the trail I had up the mountain. And when I meant mountain, I mean having to literally climb a mountain. You need to have a walking stick or hold on to trees to pull yourself upward, and keeping my feet sideways to avoid sliding down the steep hill. It was a beautiful day, and it wasn't miserably hot out. I could hear birds and squirrels scuttering about as we were making our way up the hillside off in the distance. I spotted a skunk. Fred acted like he was going to run towards it, so I told him no and to stay away from that, and he just sat down and looked at me disappointed. We kept our distance from it and walked away. We kept going on into the opposite direction. Once I was sure we were out of this thing's stink zone, we continued up the hill to where I knew it leveled off a bit so I could sit down and rest and get a bite to eat. About 45 minutes later, we came into a clearing of a wide level spot where the trees weren't so thick. I sat down on a tree and got my backpack and pulled out my food and had lunch. Having it with Fred, I had found a big leaf and poured in some water for him to drink. We sat there for a while after eating and seeing a couple of does come into the clearing, but when they noticed us, they hurried back off into the brush. This has always been as far as I've been, and is usually where I head back. I decided since I still had some daylight left, I'd keep going up the hill, since I've never been further than this. We started going farther up the hill, and I took my time this time, and kept in mind the way back to the clearing since I'd never been this far before, and watching my steps because there were a lot of mountain breaks in the area. We made it almost to the top of the mountain. Fred went over to the big pile and sat on my backpack, and I began to look through my backpack. I found a lot of cool fossils, so this got me excited. There were a lot of them, so I was there for a few hours breaking apart layers of rocks, looking through them. I was there longer than I realized, and when I looked at my watch it was about 7:30 p.m.
so I would have to move quickly if I was going to make it back home before dark. So I put the fossils I found in my backpack and started down the hill. I didn't go straight back down towards the clearing, and decided to go back down a different way to learn a new path. And now, I regret it. Going down at a side angle rather than straight down was taking longer, and with the heavy cover of the trees, it was now almost pitch black. I did bring my flashlight, and continuing my descent, it just hit me that it was completely silent. Like dead silent. No birds, no squirrels and cicadas like before, just silence. Now, I knew this was weird, but I just brushed it off thinking that maybe it was because I was there. So I kept walking. I should have heeded the warning for silence, but I didn't. About 15 minutes after I noticed the silence, I noticed Fred was acting strangely, like he was in hunt or alert mode. He ran a little bit in front of me and stopped and looked back at me like he wanted me to stop, so I did. I also had this feeling of dread just take over me. We weren't far from the clearing where we ate earlier, just we were a little parallel to it. He was staring in its direction, and his hair on his back of his neck was standing straight up, and his ears were pinned back, and every time I would try to walk towards him, he would growl at me. Keep in mind, this dog never growled at me before or showed any sign of aggression, so I knew something was near that he really didn't like. I stood there for maybe another minute or two waiting for him just to keep going, but he never moved a muscle. That's when I started to smell this ungodly stench. I mean, it was unbearable. My first thought that it may have been the skunk we seen earlier, but this wasn't a skunk smell. This smelled more like a week-old rotten carcass, or some sort of meat that had been dead long ago. It made my eyes water and burn the back of my throat every time I took a breath. It made me gag so much to the point that I threw up. I tried to move on down the hill to attempt just to get away from the thing, but oh my gosh, it was so hard to get Fred. Fred ran back in front of me and growled at me again and started walking towards me, growling as if pushing me in the opposite direction. Seeing his reaction and hurrying my pace, I lost my balance on the steep hillside and tripped over a large protruding tree root, and before hitting the ground I tried to catch myself on a small tree. When I grabbed it, it snapped because it didn't support my weight, and I pretty much just went straight to the ground. I started to hear tree branches breaking and twigs breaking as if something had heard me and was coming towards me. After about 3 snaps, it stopped. I listened for a moment and didn't hear anything else, so I figured whatever it was stopped and I brushed it off as a coyote or something. Although it sounded like it was a lot bigger than a coyote, and at this point I just wanted to get home because I was completely scared and it was dark now. So I picked up the flashlight that I dropped when I tripped and started to take a step when Fred ran right out in front of me and didn't growl but nipped at me so I wouldn't keep going. I just kept wondering what his deal was. Then about that time I heard the noise again. But this time the steps were much closer and I started to feel the fear rush through me. Now, when Fred usually sees or hears something, he books it right towards it. This time he was standing completely still except for shifting from left to right, as if to say, in between me and something else. I showed my flashlight around where I was standing frantically, looking for whatever had him in guard dog mode, but I didn't see anything. Then I heard another crack and whipped my light beam into the direction that it came from, and my light wasn't bright enough to see any details, but in the distance, probably about 50 feet or so in front of Fred, was a huge outline of some kind of thing. It did look like some kind of animal because it was on all fours, but it was just too dark to make out anything else really. Still seeing something this big, and I'm thinking bear at this point, I started backing up very slowly, but every step away from it would just make it come closer. I don't really know how to explain this, it was just so nerve-wracking. At this point, I was getting really freaked out, so my instinct was to just run like hell. So I turned around and started running down the hillside as fast as I could without falling, and Fred flipped. He ran right behind me, growling and barking at me. He nipped at me and caught the back of my pant leg and I fell. I stood back up, and not 15 feet in front of where I was falling was this thing. I looked in front of me, where it stood, and realizing what I thought it was, it just made me angry for Fred acting the way he was. It just looked like a huge deer, like a really huge deer. So I yelled at him, "Fred, that's a damn deer, dude, chill out." After I said this, it raised up on its hind legs. I thought to myself, wait, hold up. So when I shone my flashlight on it, I got a better look at it, and now I wish I really hadn't. Because what I saw is burned in my mind. It did look like a deer, but it looked like it was dead, long dead. I could see pieces of skin and hair missing. It had legs bent like a deer, but a misshapen deer, like they had been broken and healed back all wrong. Its face scared the unholy hell out of me, more than anything. It had an elongated like snout, but I could see a lot of the skull was protruding, like it was half rotted. Its teeth were long and sharp, and looked like it was too big for its mouth. It had no lips, almost like it had gnawed them off itself. I could see the teeth, roots, and all in its mouth. Its eyes were sunken back into its sockets but glowed a bright yellow in my flashlight. This thing also had an incredible set of antlers. They were huge, but they didn't look majestic like a deer or elk. They looked uneven and just unnatural. The height of this thing scared me the most, I think. It had to be easily 9 to 10 feet. I'm 5'6", and it was twice the height of me. As if the rest of it wasn't frightening enough, this thing had hands. On the front legs, no hooves, but hands like a person. But at the end of each finger were dark-colored claws. Also, this was what we smelled. This thing smelled awful. We just stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at each other. I was so scared I felt like I couldn't move, and I felt like my heart was in my throat. Fred was in between me and this thing. He was barking and growling and snapping, and this thing didn't seem the least bit bothered by him, but just continued to stare at me, which scared the living crap out of me even more. I finally snapped out of my trance for a second and started taking a couple of steps backwards slowly. And for every step I would take back, it would come forward and back Fred closer to me. I continued to back up for a while because Fred was at least giving me a barrier. Finally, I realized I wasn't too far from home. I looked down the hill through the trees and could see the pole light that was in front of my house. When I looked back in front of me, it was gone. I quickly scanned the area with my light and didn't see it anymore, and although Fred was still going nuts, I decided to make my chance and run for it. So I took off as quickly as I could, and I made it about 100 feet from the bottom of the hill, which led into the driveway of my house. The whole time I was running, I could hear this thing running with me parallel to where I was. It was clearly a lot faster than me, and moved through the trees and steep hillside with ease. I knew there was no way I could make it down in time without falling or this thing catching me and doing God knows what. So I stopped and looked around trying to figure out what to do when I spotted it behind a tree about the same distance from me as before. I was trying to think of a way to get away when it hit me that I had my walking stick and spear. I knew it wouldn't do much as I was probably too far to even pierce its skin, but it might at least buy me some time to get off the hill and into my house. So I waited for it to step out from behind me, but it just stayed there with its head peeking out, staring at me. So I took a few quick steps and it stepped out in my direction. Here was my chance. I figured this was the only way it might at least give me a chance. I reared back as hard as I could and looked at Fred and yelled as stern as I could, "Fred, come now!" And I threw the spear at the thing. Of course, it just bounced off, but it looked away from me and down at the stick and spear. So I took off as fast as I could, and as soon as I turned, I heard this thing let out that scream I heard a couple of months before. But being this close, it was ear-splitting. I could hear it start moving in my direction. That's when I heard something growling and biting it, and then it hit me. Fred wasn't in front of me. I looked back over my shoulder and seen him lunging at this thing, and I heard it let out that blood-curdling scream again. Then I heard something land in the leaves on the ground.
I knew it was probably Fred that he had slung off, but it was too late to look back. Running down the steep incline was tough, and I lost my balance and slid the rest of the way down on my back till I hit the bottom and got up without looking behind me, and took off up my driveway and ran into my back door and slammed and locked it behind me. I stood there for a second with my fingers still on the lock and my head leaning against the door, then raced to make sure my front door was locked and let the shades down. My mom was in the room, just standing there, confused. She was sitting there on her bed, and she started to scold me for being gone so late, and then I realized how freaked out I was. She ran up to me and walked over to my bed and sat me down on there. She started asking what happened, and I couldn't say anything. I just held my arm, which was bleeding from sliding down the hill, and stared at the floor. She went into the bathroom and got some things to clean the bandage up on my arm. While she was wrapping it, she was glancing around and then she asked me, "Where's Fred?" I looked up at her, tearing up, and didn't say anything. I couldn't. She yelled for my dad, who was in the living room, and told him to get his gun and walk outside to see if he could find Fred. Immediately I sprang up and grabbed his arm and begged for him not to go outside, at least not until morning. Now I usually don't scare easily, so seeing my concern, he agreed to go in the morning. I finally snapped out of it after a few hours and told my mom exactly what had happened. Of course she told me it was probably a bear or a rabid buck, but I knew it wasn't. It was something else. It had to be. I took a nap, and I woke up a few hours later to the sound of my dad returning, when everything came rushing back to me and I realized it wasn't a dream. Suddenly I remembered Fred. I got up and ran to the back door where he was and asked him if he found Fred. He just put his head down and looked at the floor and solemnly nodded. He had gone back to where I was last night when I made my run and seen blood and fur but no Fred. He noticed a drag trail in the leaves and up the hill to the clearing where I always went. That's where he found Fred, or at least what he thinks was Fred. He said it was pieces of flesh just thrown around like something had swallowed a bomb. So I asked, how can you be sure it was him? Maybe he just ran somewhere else. Then he sadly reached into his pocket and pulled out Fred's collar, which was stained in black now. I lost it. After that, I have never been back up in those hills, and a few years later I moved to a different area for college. This thing, whatever it was, killed my dog, my best friend, my guardian. I think Fred saved my life that night. Had he not lunged at it and took its attention off of me, who knows what would have happened. I might not be here today. I never heard the scream again, and I've never saw it again. But after that, I didn't have Fred. I never went out after dark, and I started driving to school.
Hello Swamp Dweller, I am a New Orleans urban explorer, but this is by far my worst experience. I always had a dream of going to Paris. Not to see the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre, or any of the typical tourist hotspots, but actually to see the Paris catacombs. I had been urban exploring in an abandoned building and cemeteries of my hometown since I was probably 10 or even younger. I've even traveled to a couple of other states just to document my findings. Normally, the scariest thing I would see would be a homeless person or a creepy statue in a graveyard. Nothing to feel that threatened by. But in 2014, when my older sister told me that she would be traveling to Europe for a vacation over the summer, I begged to come along. I was 18 then, and desperate to get away from the humdrum of everyday life, and finally fulfill my childhood dream of going to the catacombs to explore. I had been planning it out for years. I would enter through the tunnel that I had seen YouTubers enter through online, bring a fishing reel with hundreds of yards of fishing line, and at each end of the line, I would attach it to the entrance. I would let out the slack, attach the reel to my backpack, with basically a fallback system so if I got lost. When I was done, I would simply reel my way back. It had made perfect sense to my narrow-minded teenage self. I wanted to go to the areas of the catacombs that people hadn't seen in hundreds of years. To go where no one else had been before was my dream as an urban explorer, and to me, there was nothing more exciting than going where you knew nobody else would be and places that were forbidden. There'd be no one ruining the moment by bumping into a fellow explorer. So, after weeks of convincing, my college-age sister agreed to take me with her. It took a lot of talking to get her to agree to bring her little brother along, but with help from my parents, she decided she would make the best of it. First, we went to Dublin, then London, which to me was pretty boring, then across the English Channel to our first stop in mainland Europe, Paris. I tried to get her to come with me, but she noped right out of it, insisting on seeing the beautiful city instead, and who could blame her? While she wanted to see the Eiffel Tower and all that other good stuff, I stayed at the hotel and waited for the evening to come when the weather cooled off a bit and made my way to the entrance by myself. First by cab, then by foot. As I made my way back towards the crevice that led into the infamous Paris catacombs, I felt eager, almost energized. I stood at the entrance and looked into the pitch black and almost immediately crawled in. Once inside, I took the end of my fishing line and tied it to a big stone. No way I was going to get lost. I turned on my dollar store LED flashlight, cheap right, let out the reel, and started my journey. At first, I snaked my way through what seemed like dozens of rooms covered with graffiti and evidence of teenage parties that famously took place there. After what seemed like an hour of reading what were almost definitely French curse words all over the cave system and ghoulish figures spray painted on the ancient walls, there seemed to be what I was looking for. On the other side of the large room I was entering, I could see the bare wall, with no sign of human disturbance. Great, I thought to myself. Now the work really begins. As I drew closer, there was a shallow tunnel on my left that seemed to go only about 20 yards before a dead end, rubble strewn about. So I looked to my right and saw a narrow tunnel leading directly from the dusty room. It was so small that I would have to crouch just to walk through it. Somehow, no matter how much I shined my flashlight down it, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. A total absence of light. It was the first time that I doubted the journey. Up until then, it seemed like fun and games, but now the feeling of aloneness dawned on me. If I encountered trouble, there would be no one to help, but I felt drawn to complete my lifelong quest, and with a gulp, I cautiously made my way in. With 10 feet inside, I noticed the bottom of the medieval passage had begun to fill with water. At first, I thought my waterproof shoes would do the trick, but I soon found myself crouched over, drenched and drudging my way through the tunnel, with water up to my knees. The tunnel aimed gradually downwards, even further into the underworld beneath the city of Paris. Too late to turn back now. I kept going, and after a minute, there was a fork in the passage. One got smaller, narrowing to 4 feet tall, and the other got bigger. I'd say about 7. Not too hard to guess which one I took. I heard the catacombs originally served as a mining system in the Middle Ages, but as I made my way further, the place seemed anything but an innocent miner's workplace. After about 100 feet further, the walls on either side widened into what seemed almost like a lobby, and small rooms lined either side of me. I was beginning to feel very uneasy at this point. I had seemed to be so brave at the entrance, in that teenage party paradise just over an hour earlier, but now I could not help but feel watched. I didn't want to know what was in these rooms, though I had a strong suspicion. My footsteps grew slower as they continued to kick up centuries-old dust below. I knew I had to leave. I took the fishing reel I had brought down with me in my hand and started to turn the crank, but there was no tension. After a couple of minutes of praying to God that the line would pull tight again, the end of the line slipped through my hand. I took my flashlight and examined it. It looked gnawed through like a dog had happily chewed through it like a play toy. I'm screwed, I said to myself in desperation. All of a sudden, I heard a splash from the way I entered. At first, I thought maybe a rock had fallen into the water. I waited and turned off my flashlight. Almost the second I turned off the light, I heard what sounded like sharp, clunky footsteps furiously running at me, and I bolted to my left towards a network of increasingly smaller rooms. Each room I entered, I staggered over jagged items all over the floor. I have no clue how I didn't trip, especially with my flashlight still off, but I traversed my way into the room, the pile of objects becoming more difficult to manage each time before a mountain of these things prevented me from going any further. In the pitch black, I could hear heavy, unnatural breathing about 2 rooms away. I bit my tongue, begrudgingly looked around me, and took out my flashlight. Before I stood on a pile of bones, femurs, ribs, all the stuff you learn about in school, I was just mesmerized by how they were just stacked in front of me like Jenga blocks. I looked to my right, and there was a 3-foot tall tunnel. I got on all fours and furiously crawled my way through the murky, foul-smelling water, flashlight clenched between my teeth. Finally, it seemed my stalker was gone. I couldn't hear the thing anymore, but I knew I couldn't go back the way I'd came. I was going to have to find another way out. With hundreds of miles of tunnels and passageways running below Paris, I knew this was a damn tall task. But I was not about to be caught by some unknown creature down here. Sometimes the tunnel would open up and I could walk, other times it would narrow down again, and I would even have to crawl, laying on my belly just to make it through to the other end. I was getting desperately lost. I was unable to remember from which way I had came, and the tunnels would often fork away and split, forcing me to make a gut instinct decision on which way to go. It was frigid now. My teeth clattered as I brought my soaking wet self slowly through the catacombs, now feeling as though these were my last minutes on Earth. My limbs felt as though they were made of lead. It's hard to believe that what was once my dream had turned into a person's worst nightmare, lost underground in the world's biggest cemetery. But I dragged my beaten self through the maze for hours, my flashlight starting to flicker. I would turn it off for minutes at a time, trying to conserve the cheap, dinky battery inside of it, feeling my way through with my hands. I tried many times to see if I could get self-service, but of course there was none. Last time I checked it, it said 4:17 a.m. I started at around 9 o'clock. I decided that it was over. I plopped down in the water, sitting crisscross. I turned off the flashlight and closed my eyes. In my mind, I said goodbye to everyone I knew, all my family members, friends, and even acquaintances. I decided to look at a picture of my family on my phone. I clicked it on, and found the best picture of my parents, my sister, and me, and stared at it. My sister was smiling in it, and I found my eyes welling up with tears. It made me feel worse that she would never know what happened, that her wonderful vacation would end up being a depressing disaster. My mind went quiet, and my limbs went numb, and I accepted that this was the end. How fitting for an urban explorer, huh? Just when I leaned my back against the wall, I heard a familiar splash about 50 feet away. I jumped and grabbed my flashlight and ran away like a roadrunner from the cartoon. With no bones to trample on, I was running at what seemed like an Olympic sprinter's pace, and I felt hopeful as those same clunky footsteps started to fade. I was starting to grin when boom, I collided headfirst with a wall. Dead end. Through my throbbing headache, I could hear the dreadful pitter-patter growing louder. Finally, it seemed to stop about 10 feet away, and that horrid breathing echoed in the passage around me. A step closer, and my hands were trembling. I decided to turn on the flashlight. If I was ready to die, I was going to at least know what finished me off and take it like a man. I flicked it on, and the sight before me nearly scared me to death before it could even lay a finger on me. It was dark gray, withered, ancient, void of emotion. What I saw before me was a disgustingly hunched yet still 6-foot tall skeleton, jawbone hanging down as though it was panting. Its empty sockets peered down at me, and though it had no eyes, I found myself in a staring contest with it. Soon, it started convulsing. I could hear a small whimper coming from its bones. It's the weirdest thing to explain. It grew louder, almost into a chuckle, and finally an all-out hysterical laughing. The shriek echoed throughout the lonely catacombs. Its bones shook and rattled with every painful laugh. It didn't seem to come from its mouth, rather it seemed to be vibrating from the skeleton itself. It sounded almost like a demonic joker, until it grew silent. It bent down from its already stooped position, unnaturally long arms stretched out towards me, and sprinted at me in full speed. I was still collapsed on the ground with a throbbing head, I did the only thing I could do. I leaped up and waited until it was about a foot from me, and grabbed its bony arm with my left hand, flashlight dropping into the water. I immediately took my right fist and slammed it with as much might as my entire body had, straight into the skull. Screaming like a middle school girl, I closed my eyes and heard a big crack. I was prepared to be attacked back in revenge, but silence followed. I slowly reopened them and picked my flashlight back up and pointed it around. Arriving at the ground below, the skeleton had lost all life. Now, just a pile of bones, front first, in the puddle at my feet. Its skull had been bent severely from its neck, now almost perpendicular to the spine. Had I just killed a skeleton? What was it even doing alive to begin with? I stared down at my hand, which is surprisingly unharmed. What the hell? I asked myself in amazement. How did I not have a nasty gash from where my aching knuckles made contact with bare bone? I decided to power walk away from the scene, in case the thing could still come back from the afterlife and approach me again. I cautiously waited until I was about 40 paces away to turn back with the light. It was gone. There was nothing in the water, not a single rib anywhere. If anything, this scared me even worse. I kept walking back the way I came, and all of a sudden I felt my confidence return to me, like how it was when I entered the catacombs several hours earlier. I felt strangely good, like something was urging me, telling me that I could find my way back. Deciding to attempt a miracle and retrace my steps, I conserved the flashlight light as well as I could. And after a few more hours of dragging myself through the tunnels, after a combination of walking, limping, and crawling, I started to recognize where I was. Before I knew it, I was slithering my way back through the muddy passage into the endless rooms of bones. I turned on my flashlight to see the same pile from earlier and even had the gall to laugh at it. That's nothing compared to what I saw earlier, I thought to myself. I made my way through other rooms, through the hall, and back through the pitch black tunnel into the large room. Now I looked at the far side and felt like I won the lottery when I saw a crudely spray-painted SpongeBob on the wall. Civilization, kind of. I knew my flashlight was about to go out, but in its last moments of life, I somehow found the end of my fishing line. Of all things it had gotten snagged on, it was a broken chair that some person had brought inside the room. I turned the light off and felt my way back to the entrance using only my hands and fishing line through the pitch dark. Not gonna lie, I tripped a couple of times and walked into a couple of walls, but I wasn't about to let that stop me now. Before I knew it, I could hear and smell the fresh air. As I reached the end of the line, I looked up to see the tunnel entrance. And with my last bit of strength, I lifted my cold, aching body through the crevice and into the entrance above. As I made my way into the morning light, I winced, my ears relishing the sound of the morning traffic and bustle of the city. I slowly walked through the streets of Paris back to the hotel. I had lost my phone in the process of being pursued and couldn't order up a cab to pick me up, but I was just happy to be alive at that point. When I finally got to the hotel room, I knocked on the door. My sister had opened it. She had tears in her eyes and looked as though she had been crying the whole night. She instantly threw her arms around me and kissed me on the cheek, saying, "I thought I'd never see you again. I was so worried." So we ended up enjoying the rest of our European vacation, making sure not to lose sight of each other after that. I told her, and everybody else for that matter, that I had gotten lost, but I never mentioned the skeleton that attacked me. Sometimes I wonder if that was even real. Maybe my mind started to play tricks on me, in some sort of hysteria and tiredness. I don't know, and that's probably a good thing. My urban exploration days are over now, but this experience has always nagged at my conscience. I came here because the memory and the whole ordeal just haunts me. Sometimes I wake up at night screaming, having nightmares about being lost underground or being chased once again. Maybe, by finally sharing my story, I can put this whole thing to rest. Thank you for sharing my story. We wanted to have a good time together, my girlfriend and I. You see, she's a nurse and has to work the night shift. The hospital she works at requires about 5 years of experience before you can even think about working on the day shift. This wouldn't be such a problem, but I work as a marketer. I have a typical 9 to 5 in an office, and it's really tough finding time for each other. Our sleep schedules are chaotic, to say the least. So, when Valentine's Day rolled around on a day and night that we were both working, we got really frustrated. It's really hard to explain how you feel like you're being cheated at a time. Like, there isn't going to be a moment you can sit down and truly enjoy your relationship for what it is. But we decided that we weren't going to let our lame schedules get the best of us. We decided that we'd visit a city for a weekend, away. Valentine's Day fell on a Thursday, but we figured having a little trip that weekend would be the next best thing, maybe even better. She's been really adamant about visiting Oak Ridge in Tennessee. Her grandfather worked there back in the day, and it's always been an interest of her. She's always telling me these facts about how creepy it is and how she just has to go one day. It's roughly an 8-hour drive from where we live, so we made a deal about driving. I was going to drive the entire way there, and she was going to drive while we were actually in the city. She totally got a good deal of the bargain, but that's just what you do when you care for your girlfriend. But something strange happened, something that has tainted my memory ever since then. When I think back and remember that weekend away, I'm not thinking about us cuddling up on the couch or any of the fun places we got to visit there either. We got there Friday night. She mostly slept in the car, but still felt really tired. She told me she'd be able to sleep at night once we got there, and be awake and be normal for the next day. So that's just what we did, and it was a really good day. We got to visit a museum and learn all about the Manhattan Project. Even got to visit a plant where her grandfather used to work. At least, we're pretty sure it's the one he worked at. He's deceased now, so no real way of telling. But the tour guide said this was where the majority of them worked, when the bombs were done. And well, I guess he worked on the bombs. Anyway, the day was great, but it didn't last very long. By the time it was dark, we were out of ideas for things to do and quite frankly out of energy. We decided to visit our favorite fast food joint, Wendy's. Don't judge us, and she was driving as we made our way there. It was only 10 or 15 minutes away from where we were. She had her music on and I was just kind of looking out the window. At one point, a blue Mustang was beside our car. We were stopped at a red light, and I looked out the window and peered into theirs. I saw a very old man. He looked unhappy, miserable even. His skin looked unnaturally pale, but I'm not sure when he started, but he was staring at me. It wasn't until I looked into the car that I noticed it either. Not gonna lie, kinda freaked me out. We made eye contact for about 5 seconds, and then for the briefest of moments, he smiled. But it was so fast. It must have been a split second that his mouth went into a smile and then back into a frown. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. I looked over at my girlfriend, and she hadn't noticed at all. She was jamming out to Bohemian Rhapsody. The light turned green and we were in motion again. I didn't take my eyes off that car for the rest of the ride. At least, until they turned. That's not the craziest part. You see, it gets even weirder. We were planning on leaving Monday morning, and on Sunday night, we went out to eat. But this time to an actual restaurant. We weren't feeling fast food again. We looked on Google and found a local restaurant that had pretty decent reviews. I had my favorite food, deep fried chicken. So off we went. I had completely forgotten about that strange man I saw in that car. But about halfway through my meal, I noticed him again. This time, though, he was in the restaurant. He was staring at me. I know he was. And when I noticed, he did the same exact facial movement. Just the way I remembered. He went from a miserable frown to a split-second smile. And then he was back to frowning in just an instant. I'm not entirely sure my reaction was warranted. He hadn't actually done anything wrong to me, and I was enjoying a nice meal with my girlfriend. This is why it was so strange for my fight-or-flight instinct to kick in. I went up and confronted him. He was sitting at a booth alone. I asked him why he was looking at me. To my absolute surprise, he never said a word. Just sat there and frowned at me. I asked him what his problem was before my girlfriend told me it was time, and we headed home. She knows I can get a little worked up and wanted to avoid some sort of confrontation. It's not illegal to look at people, she said. Still though, it was something about that man that made me feel so strange, so watched. Well, Monday morning came. We were about an hour into the car ride, And she was asleep again. And you guessed it. You totally guessed it. I saw this freaky old man again. But this time it was way worse. For starters, he was driving a totally different car. I don't know what this guy's life is like, but I can just imagine what you have to do to be able to afford a Mustang and still have enough money to have a second car. And to make matters even worse, he had been in the left lane as he was going to pass me. But he didn't. He just placed me for about a mile. I noticed that there was a car next to me. It wasn't until I looked over to flip the bird that I recognized him. It was a creepy old man, but he wasn't frowning anymore. That smile that he'd been able to muster for a split second was now permanently stained on his aged face. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. Suddenly he turns his head forward and aggressively veers his car in my direction. Reflexively, I slam the brakes and swerve off to the side of the road. My girlfriend is shaken awake and all we can see is a vehicle speeding off in the distance through a cloud of dirt. My heart was racing like crazy, and by the time I could process my girlfriend screaming, asking what's going on, I started to feel myself choke up. We discussed whether or not we should waste our time calling the police, but I was so scared. The best possible course of action seemed to be just to get the hell out of that godforsaken town as fast as possible. The rest of the ride home happened without incident, and I haven't seen him since. Needless to say, that was the least romantic and most insane Valentine's Day I have ever had. I live in Florida, and this incident happened about 3 weeks after Hurricane Irma, so not that long ago. Back in July, the ex and I had just finalized the divorce, and I moved into a gated neighborhood where every house was rented out by the same several rental company or landlords. It's a very small neighborhood, with about 15 houses tops. All 15 houses are bordered around a man-made lake with the backyards facing the lake. No one really has a fenced backyard. When you walk out your back door, you see a lake in front of you, and your neighbor's backyard on each side of you. Everyone in the neighborhood seemed very close. Someone was always hosting a family-friendly barbecue or having people over to watch sports. I was, or am, still depressed by my divorce. So, I never really partook in these social gatherings. The only person I got to know was my next-door neighbor, Steve, an active Navy soldier with a huge love for guns. Steve is the true hero in this nightmare. My daughter, Alice, is 4 years old, and I get her every weekend. Alice's bedroom window faces the backyard towards the lake. I spoil that girl to death. She truly is my everything, and I count down the days to the weekend every week just to be with her. That's why I was upset when Irma came and I had to go almost 3 weeks without seeing her. The weekend before the storm, she was with her mom. Then obviously, the weekend of the storm, she was with her mom. Then, on top of that, the weekend after, she had to be with her mom because my power was still out. No AC in Florida is miserable. The humidity was so bad that week that I slept in my daughter's room the whole week because she had the only room with a window that faced the lake. I opened the window, exposing just the window screen, so the wind from the lake could come and cool my room as much as possible while I slept. Eventually, the power comes back, and Alice starts visiting me again like normal. That was when the nightmares started. My daughter would complain about the singing lady, and how she doesn't like her anymore. I thought maybe she was referring to one of my ex's friends or one of the teachers at her school. Maybe there was a teacher at her school that sang to the kids and she didn't like it. That Saturday night, Alice woke up in the middle of the night screaming bloody murder. I ran into her room and turned on the light and found her hiding under her covers. I asked her what was wrong, and all she could do was point to an empty corner of her room and say, "Look, look!" There was nothing there. She was acting as if she saw a ghost. After I calmed her down, she started to talk about the singing lady again. "Please tell the singing lady not to come back. Please, Daddy, make her go away." Obviously, she's having nightmares, right? I showed her there was nothing in the closet and nothing under the bed, and that there was nothing to be afraid of. She calmed down and went back to sleep. I went back to my room and quickly fell back asleep myself. I couldn't have been asleep more than 20 minutes before Alice comes running into my room screaming, "She's back! She's back!" Alice absolutely refused to go back to her room, so I let her sleep with me. The next morning, Sunday morning, I took Alice out to breakfast, and we stopped by Target to pick up a baby monitor. I haven't used one since her mom and I were married, but I wanted to easily be able to hear if or when she started having these nightmares again, so I could respond quicker. After I set them up, I showed Alice how they worked to give her assurance that I could hear her and she was safe. That night she slept soundly and didn't make a peep all night. The following weekend, Alice had to stay with her mother again because she caught a stomach virus from one of her little friends at school. It was Saturday night, and I was sound asleep in my bed. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A woman's voice, humming a soft nursery rhyme through the baby monitor. The humming, soft singing got louder and clearer as the voice got closer to the monitor. I wasn't dreaming. I could hear a woman softly singing lullabies in my daughter's bedroom. I had never been so scared and dumbfounded in my life. I was feeling a mixture of pure terror and disbelief. Then the voice spoke out. "Alice? Sweetie, are you awake?" Adrenaline shot through my veins. I jumped out of bed and locked my bedroom door. I picked up my cell and called Steve from next door. He didn't waste a second. As soon as I got off the phone with him, I heard him storm out of his back door screaming, "Don't fucking move!" I ran outside and found him, aiming a shotgun at a woman crouched outside my daughter's window. The one I had left open after Irma and had never closed. Steve quickly dropped his guard when he recognized the woman. It was Jean, the neighborhood maintenance woman. Steve's wife came running out after him and confirmed it was her. Jean played dumb, said she was not singing, and didn't even know my daughter's name. She said she was near my daughter's window because she was doing her weekly patrol for gators and thought she saw one approach our house from the lake. I called bullshit. That bitch was singing, and she called out to my daughter by name. Yeah, it's true that there have been a few gator spottings around the neighborhood, and yes, part of Jean's job was to patrol the lake at night and every now and then, but at 2 a.m., I obviously knew this was BS. And even though neither Steve or his wife called her out on it, I could tell from the look on their faces that they didn't believe it either. The next morning, I went over to Steve's house to thank him and tell him exactly what happened. He told me Jean and her husband had been known to be a little cuckoo, but this was by far the craziest thing that had ever happened. Steve helped me install metal bars on Alice's window that afternoon. A bit of backstory before I begin. This happened in 2007 in upstate New York on Christmas night, around 8:30 p.m. The day was pleasant and festive, opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, hearty breakfast made by Dad, delicious smells from the kitchen as Mom and Dad prepared a feast, visits from extended family bringing pies and cakes for dessert. Around 2, we all sat down to eat, and then lazed about for the rest of the afternoon into the evening. At about 8, after everyone had left and the food was all put away for round 2 the following day, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would be about 10 minutes if I took the back roads to get there, so I did. First, a little background on where my friend lived. It was a housing development surrounding a private lake. You might call it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around the lake, the road surrounding it went in a spiral sort of shape. The houses were sparsely positioned on the outermost part of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot more houses positioned closer together nearer the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached the house. His house, along with all the others, were far enough apart that you couldn't see them from the road as you were driving by. There were woods on either side of them, with long driveways and open fields. You could see porch lights in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered into the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles per hour down to 20. There were no street lights in the development, and for some reason, I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit because there were speed bumps in every 30 feet or so. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side window open slightly, taking in some fresh air. I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me. I normally always listen to music when driving. I must have been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day. I reached a section of the road that had barren fields on either side and woods set to the back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees. As I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road, coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car, and it was exactly parallel. This is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on two long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong-looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It was light-colored. I'm not sure whether it was white, tan, yellow, or grayish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin. It wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off of its back. I don't know what it was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had, but the mouth and jaw were notably large. It had pointed things atop its head. Two things going straight upward with something mingled between the two things. That's what I got from a quick scan, and from my observation of it, as it neared my car and as my car neared it. As my car became parallel to it within a split second, I went from looking out my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. At that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth open wide. Out came a remarkable scream that I'll never forget. It gives me chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill shriek, enveloped by a deep guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was all happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked or anything. I continued driving and continued past my friend's house and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened, and I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get home. Later on, I was in total shock after it sunk in. Had my driver's side window been opened fully, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what this was. Has anyone else ever seen anything like this? Thanks for listening to these disturbing, scary stories. If you enjoyed them, please hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit that subscribe button and be sure to turn on all notifications to never miss a new video. I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you have a scary story you would like to send in to be heard on a future video, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going. You can download your favorite scary stories from the swamp on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, and just about everywhere else you find scary stories. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.